What began as a quiet administrative alert inside the royal medical system suddenly triggered a chain reaction that would ripple through Kensington Palace. A name had appeared where it absolutely should not have been. Within minutes, palace officials realized the request wasn't routine, and the person connected to it was someone at the very top of the royal hierarchy. When Prince William saw the notification, the silence in the room turned heavy with disbelief. At first, the alert looked ordinary. Inside the tightly monitored network that protected the royal family's private medical information, small notifications occasionally appeared when someone attempted to access restricted records without the proper authorization. Most of the time, those alerts were harmless. A staff member mistyped credentials. A new assistant misunderstood the system. A routine check triggered an automatic flag. It happened, though rarely, and almost always ended with a simple explanation. That morning, however, something felt different. The notification that appeared on the internal system belonged to a category rarely seen even by senior administrators. It signaled an attempt to access one of the most tightly protected files in the entire royal medical network, the confidential medical records belonging to Catherine, Princess of Wales. The administrator who noticed it stared at the screen for several seconds, expecting the system to refresh and reveal some obvious technical mistake. Catherine's records were protected by multiple layers of authorization. Only a small circle of physicians and trusted palace officials had clearance to even see that such files existed. Accessing them required both formal authorization and verification through multiple security checks. Yet the alert remained. Someone had attempted to bypass those protections. At first, the medical staff assumed it had to be a clerical error. Systems malfunctioned. Digital platforms glitched. Perhaps a department had entered the wrong identification code while processing routine updates. No one in the palace wanted to believe that anyone would intentionally attempt to intrude on Catherine's private health information. But when the system logs were opened and reviewed more carefully, the explanation became harder to accept. The request had not come from the medical team. It had not originated from Catherine's doctors or authorized staff inside Kensington Palace. Instead, the digital trail pointed somewhere unexpected, somewhere that immediately caused unease among the administrators reviewing the data. The authorization channel connected to the request appeared to originate from an administrative office linked to Queen Camilla's private household. At first, no one spoke. The possibility seemed almost impossible. There had to be some misunderstanding buried somewhere inside the technical data. Someone must have routed a request through the wrong channel. A staff member could have mistakenly used the wrong identification code. The palace operated through countless departments, and mistakes were always possible. But the system logs were precise. They didn't guess. They recorded. And what they recorded showed an access attempt directed specifically at Catherine's confidential medical files. Within minutes, senior palace aides were notified quietly. The situation was treated with extreme discretion. No one wanted to trigger panic inside the palace, especially over something that might still prove to be a simple misunderstanding. But there was one person who needed to know. Prince William was informed privately by one of his most trusted advisors, someone who understood both the sensitivity of the information and the potential consequences if it were mishandled. The conversation happened quietly, behind closed doors, far from the usual rhythm of palace activity. At first, William simply listened. He asked the advisor to repeat the information. Then he asked to see the records himself. The room remained still as the details were explained again: the alert, the restricted access attempt, the connection to Catherine's medical files, and the administrative trail leading toward Queen Camilla's office. For a moment, William said nothing. The disbelief was visible in the silence before he finally spoke. Catherine's privacy had always been sacred to him. Throughout their years in the public eye, they had carefully guarded the boundaries between their public duties and their private lives. Health matters especially were protected with absolute discretion. Only a handful of trusted professionals were ever permitted to know details. The idea that someone inside the royal structure might have attempted to access those files was not merely unsettling. It was deeply personal. William's reaction was controlled but unmistakable. The calm tone of his voice did little to hide the anger building beneath the surface. He did not accuse anyone. He did not jump to conclusions. Instead, he asked for one thing: proof. He instructed staff to quietly review every available access record connected to Catherine's medical files. Every log, every request, every digital trail that might explain how such an alert had appeared in the system. No assumptions. Only facts. Behind the scenes, palace staff began examining the system records with careful precision. Administrators reviewed authorization logs. Security officers checked internal access reports. Advisors quietly discussed the implications of what they were seeing. And as the investigation continued, a question slowly began to circulate among those who knew about the alert. Was this simply a technical misunderstanding? Or had someone deliberately attempted to cross a boundary that no one inside the royal family had ever dared to approach before? But as palace staff dug deeper into the system logs, the details of the access attempt revealed something far more troubling than anyone initially imagined. The first discovery was unsettling, but the second was impossible to ignore. The system logs didn't just show a random inquiry, they showed a formal attempt to open highly restricted medical files belonging to Catherine, Princess of Wales. And the digital authorization trail pointed toward a request submitted through channels associated with Queen Camilla's private office. Suddenly, what looked like a technical anomaly began to resemble something far more deliberate. As palace technicians examined the system logs more closely, the quiet unease that had first filled the room began to harden into something heavier. Royal medical files were not ordinary documents stored in a simple database. They existed behind layers of digital protection that had been built precisely to prevent unauthorized curiosity. Even most senior palace officials could not open those files. Access required medical clearance, verified credentials, and direct approval from the royal physicians responsible for the family's care. In other words, the system was designed to stop exactly the kind of request now staring back at them on the screen. The request itself had attempted something unusual. It wasn't a casual inquiry or a mistaken search. The digital command had tried to override the confidentiality barrier protecting Catherine's records, a process that would normally require multiple confirmations and official authorization. Whoever had initiated it understood enough about the system to attempt the request with specific intent. That realization alone was troubling, but the authorization trail made it worse. Every action inside the system left a fingerprint, a coded sequence showing where a request originated and which administrative channel had been used. When that trail was traced, it did not lead to a hospital office or a royal physician. Instead, it pointed toward an administrative login connected to Queen Camilla's private staff. At first, the administrators reviewing the information struggled to accept what they were seeing. The palace operated through dozens of departments, and digital systems often overlapped. It was possible that someone had used the wrong login credentials. It was possible that a staff member from another office had accidentally routed a request through Camilla's administrative channel. Possible, but increasingly unlikely. The deeper they looked, the clearer the pattern became. The request had been submitted using an internal access route, typically reserved for aides working within Camilla's household staff. It did not confirm that Camilla herself had made the request, but it connected the attempt directly to someone within her administrative circle. That detail changed everything. The moment the connection was confirmed, the atmosphere inside the palace offices shifted from confusion to quiet alarm. Conversations that had begun with cautious curiosity now carried an unmistakable tension. No one spoke loudly. No one wanted speculation to travel beyond the small group of people reviewing the records. But everyone understood the significance of what they were seeing. If the system logs were accurate, someone within Queen Camilla's administrative orbit had attempted to access Catherine's private medical information. The implications were explosive. Senior palace advisors were informed discreetly, each conversation conducted with careful language and deliberate calm. The matter had to be handled with extreme sensitivity. Accusations within the royal household carried consequences far beyond ordinary workplace disputes. Every word mattered, yet the questions could not be ignored. Did the request originate from a curious aide acting independently? Had someone misunderstood the system and triggered the alert by mistake? Or had the attempt been made with direct authorization from someone much higher within the royal structure? The uncertainty began spreading quietly through the palace's inner circles. Advisors exchanged cautious messages. Security officers reviewed digital access logs. Administrators rechecked the system again and again, hoping to find an innocent explanation buried somewhere in the data. But the evidence remained stubbornly consistent. Meanwhile, the information reached Prince William. The message delivered to him was careful, but unmistakable. Someone connected to Camilla's office had attempted to bypass the medical confidentiality barrier protecting Catherine's files. The system had blocked the request before any records could be opened. But the attempt itself had been logged. For William, the issue was not merely technical. Catherine's health and privacy had always been protected with absolute care. The public saw the strength of the Princess of Wales, her grace under pressure, her unwavering presence beside William as future queen. What they rarely saw was how fiercely William guarded the private boundaries around her life, especially when it came to matters as personal as health. Hearing that someone inside the palace had tried to cross that boundary struck a nerve that ran far deeper than protocol. William did not raise his voice when he received the explanation. He did not accuse anyone immediately. But those present noticed the change in his tone when he spoke next. He wanted answers. Not speculation. Not reassurance. Answers. He asked who had submitted the request, how it had been processed, and why the system had allowed it to be attempted at all. Advisors tried to explain the technical procedures, but each answer only seemed to reveal new uncertainties buried beneath the first discovery. And as William began asking those questions, calm, precise, relentless, the palace staff responsible for the investigation realized something unsettling. The more they explained how the system worked, the harder it became to understand how such a request had happened in the first place. And when William began asking questions about how such a request could even happen, the answers he received only deepened the mystery. Prince William is known for keeping his emotions controlled in public. But behind closed doors, the situation unfolding around Catherine's private medical records demanded answers. This wasn't merely a bureaucratic mistake. If someone had intentionally tried to bypass medical confidentiality, it crossed a line no royal family member had ever dared to approach before. The moment the explanation ended, William made a decision that would quietly shift the entire atmosphere inside Kensington Palace. There would be no speculation, no whispers, no palace gossip guiding the narrative. Instead, there would be a careful, deliberate investigation conducted behind closed doors. Calm on the surface, relentless underneath. He instructed his advisors to review every digital access log connected to Catherine's medical records. Not just the alert that had triggered concern, but the entire history surrounding it. Every attempted request, every system interaction, every administrative credential connected to the medical network would be examined. Nothing would be overlooked. The advisors assigned to the task understood the gravity immediately. The request had already revealed a troubling connection to an administrative channel associated with Queen Camilla's office. If that connection proved accurate, the implications would stretch far beyond a technical security issue. It would touch the fragile balance of trust within the royal household itself. As the review began, palace legal advisors were quietly consulted. Their role was not to accuse or defend anyone, but to clarify the boundaries surrounding medical confidentiality. Royal medical records were protected under strict privacy frameworks, some of the most rigid in the institution's internal protocols. Breaching those safeguards, even attempting to bypass them, was considered a serious violation. The legal advisors explained something that only deepened William's concern. Even requesting access without proper clearance could trigger formal consequences under palace governance rules. William listened carefully. He asked precise questions. Could the request have been submitted accidentally? Could someone inside Camilla's administrative team have misunderstood the system? Could a staff member have initiated the attempt without realizing the sensitivity of what they were doing? No one in the room wanted to assume the worst. Advisors carefully suggested the possibility of an innocent error, a simple mistake inside a complicated digital system. But William was not convinced. His thoughts kept returning to one central issue: Catherine. Throughout their years together, Catherine had carried enormous public responsibility with quiet strength. She had endured intense scrutiny, constant speculation, and the relentless pressure that came with standing beside the future king. Through it all, William had made one promise to himself: he would protect the privacy of their family, wherever possible. Now that boundary felt threatened. What made the situation even more unsettling was that Catherine herself remained largely unaware of what was unfolding. William had chosen not to involve her yet. Until he understood exactly what had happened, he refused to burden her with rumors or unfinished explanations. But the more he learned, the more fiercely protective he became. Meanwhile, the investigation continued quietly. System administrators reviewed access logs with forensic precision. Security officers traced internal network routes. Advisors compared authorization records from multiple departments, searching for inconsistencies that might explain the suspicious request. And then the investigation revealed something unexpected. A second internal document surfaced. It was not another alert or an automated system notification. It was an administrative confirmation file, one that referenced the same attempted access request already under scrutiny. The document confirmed that the system had registered a formal attempt to open Catherine's restricted medical files. In other words, the original alert had not been a glitch. It had been real. When the document reached William's advisors, the room grew noticeably quieter. The evidence now pointed toward a deliberate action rather than a random technical anomaly. The request had been entered, processed through the system, and blocked only because the confidentiality barrier held firm. Someone had tried. The discovery spread quietly through the small group handling the investigation. Conversations became more cautious. Advisors began speaking in careful, measured language, aware that every new detail carried potential consequences. Inside Kensington Palace, the tension was beginning to rise. Not publicly. Not in the corridors where staff moved through their daily routines, but behind closed doors, among the handful of people who understood what the investigation was uncovering, the atmosphere had shifted. This was no longer simply about a suspicious digital alert. It was about trust, about boundaries, about whether someone inside the royal household had intentionally tried to cross a line that had always been respected. And just when William believed the investigation was finally revealing the truth behind the access attempt, another piece of information emerged, one that threatened to complicate the situation even further. But just as William believed he was getting closer to understanding the situation, a new piece of information changed everything. The person who first noticed the suspicious activity wasn't a royal advisor or senior palace official. It was a quiet medical administrator whose job was simply to monitor file access requests. What she saw that morning forced her into an impossible position: report the request and potentially ignite a royal scandal, or ignore it and risk violating the strict confidentiality protecting Catherine's health records. For years, her work had been routine, almost invisible. She sat within the secure administrative wing responsible for overseeing the royal medical system, quietly monitoring digital logs that recorded every access request connected to the family's private health records. Most days passed without incident. The system was designed to protect the royal household with layers of safeguards, and those protections rarely failed. But that morning, something caught her attention. The system had flagged an irregular request, one that attempted to bypass the strict confidentiality barrier surrounding Catherine's medical records. At first glance, it appeared subtle, almost easy to overlook. But the longer she studied the alert, the more uncomfortable she became. Requests like this simply did not happen. Her training immediately kicked in. Internal guidelines were clear and uncompromising. Any suspicious attempt to access restricted medical files had to be reported immediately. No exceptions. No delays. The rule existed to protect the privacy of the royal family and to ensure that no unauthorized curiosity ever slipped through unnoticed. Yet following those guidelines suddenly felt far more complicated than the policy manual suggested, because the request she was looking at was not connected to an unknown staff member or an outside breach. The system trail pointed somewhere inside the palace itself toward a channel linked to Queen Camilla's administrative staff. For several long moments, she hesitated. Reporting the alert would set off a chain reaction inside the palace. Senior officials would be notified. Security officers would begin investigating. And if the digital trail was accurate, the situation could quickly escalate into something deeply uncomfortable for the royal household. But ignoring the alert carried its own consequences. Medical confidentiality within the royal system was treated with absolute seriousness. Catherine's health records were among the most sensitive documents in the palace network. Allowing an unauthorized request to pass without reporting it would violate the very principles she had sworn to protect. Finally, she made the decision. She flagged the request as highly irregular and forwarded the report according to protocol. Within minutes, the notification reached a senior palace security officer responsible for monitoring internal access breaches. When he opened the report and read the details, his reaction was immediate. He understood the implications instantly. This was not a routine system alert. Without hesitation, he escalated the matter directly to Kensington Palace. The message was delivered quietly but urgently. A potential attempt had been made to access Catherine's confidential medical records. The system had blocked the request, but the digital authorization trail indicated it had been submitted through a channel connected to Camilla's administrative office. Inside the palace, the seriousness of the situation became clear almost immediately. Advisors who received the report realized that even discussing the matter carried risk. If mishandled, the story could spread through staff corridors, turning into whispers that might eventually reach the press. Royal privacy was fragile, and once rumors escaped the palace walls, they were almost impossible to contain. The response was swift and discreet. Senior officials moved quietly to review the system logs, limiting knowledge of the investigation to only a handful of trusted advisors. Conversations were conducted in private offices, far from curious ears. The goal was simple: understand exactly what had happened before the situation spiraled into something uncontrollable. Meanwhile, the administrator who had filed the report began to worry. She had followed protocol, yet she understood the delicate environment she worked within. Raising concerns that involved members of the royal household could bring unwanted attention. Would someone question her judgment? Would senior staff blame her for escalating the issue? The uncertainty weighed heavily on her. Days later, when Prince William learned how the investigation had begun, he requested to speak with her privately. The meeting was brief and calm, but its message was unmistakable. William thanked her for doing exactly what the system required. Protecting Catherine's privacy, he told her, mattered more than palace comfort. For the administrator, the words brought quiet relief. She had feared backlash. Instead, she had been acknowledged for protecting a boundary that few people outside the palace ever even knew existed. But even as that moment of reassurance settled, the investigation itself was far from finished. Security officers and system analysts continued tracing the digital path of the original request, moving step by step through the palace's internal network. What they were searching for now was simple: the exact origin of the attempt. And when they finally uncovered the next piece of information hidden inside the system records, the discovery would shake the royal household in ways no one had expected. But as investigators traced the request further back through palace systems, they uncovered a detail that would send shockwaves through the royal household. Every digital request leaves a footprint, and the deeper investigators followed the trail, the clearer the path became. The authorization attempt didn't originate from random palace staff. Instead, the system logs pointed toward an administrative channel connected to Queen Camilla's private office. At that moment, what had once seemed like a technical anomaly began to look disturbingly intentional. Inside the palace's secure network, nothing truly vanished. Every request, every login, every authorization attempt left behind a quiet record tiny fragments of information stored deep within the system's digital memory. Investigators now began reconstructing those fragments piece by piece, determined to understand exactly where the access attempt had begun. At first, the trail was technical and unemotional. System timestamps, access routes, internal authentication codes. But slowly, those fragments began forming a picture that was impossible to ignore. The request had been submitted from a specific terminal, not just any terminal. A device registered within the administrative network used by aides working in Queen Camilla's private office. The discovery did not immediately prove intent. Palace systems were complex, and devices were occasionally shared among staff members during busy administrative periods. Yet the location of the terminal narrowed the circle of possible explanations dramatically. Whoever had initiated the request had done so from inside Camilla's administrative wing. The investigators double-checked the data. Then, they checked it again. The digital path remained unchanged. Within hours, the information quietly reached the small group of palace advisors overseeing the investigation. Their reaction was cautious but unmistakable. The situation had moved beyond a technical concern and into something far more sensitive. Because now the question was no longer simply how the request happened. The question had become, who authorized it? Did an aide inside Camilla's office act independently? Perhaps driven by curiosity or misunderstanding? Or had the request been made under direct instruction from someone higher within the royal hierarchy? That possibility hung heavily over every conversation. Palace aides began debating the implications in hushed discussions behind closed doors. No one wanted to rush toward accusations. The royal household operated through delicate relationships, alliances built carefully over decades. One reckless conclusion could ignite tensions that would ripple far beyond Kensington Palace. But the evidence was becoming difficult to dismiss. As new reports arrived confirming the digital trail, Prince William's frustration quietly intensified. Those closest to him noticed the shift immediately. His tone remained calm, measured, controlled, but the patience beneath it was beginning to thin. Catherine's privacy had always been sacred to him. Through years of intense public scrutiny, he had learned how easily personal boundaries could be eroded when curiosity mixed with power. Now the possibility that someone inside the royal structure had attempted to intrude on Catherine's private health information struck a nerve deeper than any public controversy ever could. For William, this was no longer about technology. It was about trust. Advisors surrounding him began offering careful advice. Some warned that confronting the situation too aggressively could create an internal rift inside the royal family. The monarchy survived on unity, and any conflict involving senior figures could quickly spiral into something far more damaging than the original issue. Others disagreed. They argued that ignoring the incident would send an even more dangerous message. If someone inside the palace could attempt to access Catherine's medical records without consequence, what boundaries would remain intact? What protections would truly matter? The debate revealed a growing divide among those closest to the situation. Some urged caution, others insisted on accountability. Meanwhile, the palace atmosphere began to change. Staff members who knew nothing about the investigation still sensed something unusual in the air. Conversations among senior aides grew quieter. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Advisors moved through the palace with a careful urgency that did not go unnoticed. Within the small circle handling the investigation, the tension was unmistakable. The evidence pointed toward Camilla's administrative network. The request had been real, and the question of authorization remained unanswered. For Prince William, the time for quiet analysis was nearing its end. He had waited patiently while advisors reviewed the evidence. He had allowed investigators to follow every digital lead. But now the information placed before him left little room for uncertainty. Sooner or later, the situation would have to be addressed directly. And when Prince William finally decided to confront the situation directly, the moment would become one of the most uncomfortable royal encounters in recent memory. Inside the palace walls, conversations between senior royals rarely become confrontational. Protocol, tradition, and discretion usually keep emotions tightly contained. But when Prince William raised the issue of Catherine's medical files, the calm royal fade began to crack. What started as a measured question quickly turned into one of the most tense discussions the palace had witnessed in years. The moment had been building quietly for days. Ever since the investigation uncovered the digital trail leading back toward Queen Camilla's administrative office, the atmosphere within Kensington Palace had grown increasingly strained. Advisors moved carefully, speaking in lowered voices, weighing every word before allowing it to leave their lips. The royal household had faced scandals before, but this situation carried a different kind of tension, one rooted not in public controversy, but in something far more personal. Catherine's privacy. Prince William had spent years defending that boundary. Through public scrutiny, relentless headlines, and the constant pressure of royal life, he had worked to ensure that certain parts of their lives remained protected. Health matters especially were sacred territory. The thought that someone within the palace might have attempted to cross that boundary was something he simply could not ignore. So he began asking questions. At first, the discussions remained contained within a small circle of senior royal aides. William requested detailed explanations about the access attempt. How had the request entered the system? Who had authorized it? Why had it been routed through an administrative channel connected to Camilla's office? The advisors responded cautiously. Some urged restraint, suggesting that the situation might still prove to be a misunderstanding, buried within complex administrative procedures. Palace systems were vast and sometimes confusing. An aide might have triggered the request accidentally while searching for unrelated documents. But the explanation felt increasingly fragile. The digital records remained clear. The request had been deliberate enough to attempt bypassing confidentiality protections. It had traveled through a channel linked to Camilla's administrative staff, and it had required at least some awareness of how the palace medical network functioned. Eventually, the conversation expanded beyond William's immediate advisors. The information reached Camilla's inner circle. When the matter was raised with them, the reaction was swift and defensive. According to those familiar with the exchange, Camilla herself expressed genuine surprise when the allegation reached her ears. The suggestion that someone from her office had attempted to access Catherine's medical records appeared to catch her completely off guard. Her aides insisted there must be a misunderstanding. They suggested that an administrative assistant may have accidentally triggered the request while handling unrelated documentation. Palace offices often dealt with overlapping schedules, health briefings, and logistical coordination involving multiple members of the royal household. Perhaps the system had misinterpreted a routine inquiry. For a brief moment, that explanation offered a fragile path toward resolution. But not everyone believed it. Some palace advisors quietly voiced a different possibility. They wondered whether curiosity, innocent or otherwise, might have motivated someone within Camilla's office to attempt the access. In an environment where information was power, even the smallest piece of personal knowledge could carry enormous influence. No one spoke those suspicions loudly, but the tension surrounding the issue was now impossible to ignore. Inside the palace, staff members who had nothing to do with the investigation began sensing that something unusual was unfolding behind closed doors. Meetings stretched longer than usual. Advisors moved through the corridors with guarded expressions. Conversations stopped abruptly when unfamiliar footsteps approached. The royal household, normally a carefully synchronized machine of tradition and routine, had entered a state of quiet unease. For William, the situation had become deeply personal. He did not accuse Camilla publicly. He did not allow anger to spill into reckless statements. But those who spoke with him during those days noticed a change in his demeanor. His questions became sharper, his patience thinner. This was no longer just about a digital request. It was about whether someone within the royal family had crossed a line that had always been respected. The debate unfolding inside palace walls began to expose deeper fractures within the household. Some advisors worried that pursuing the issue too aggressively could ignite a conflict between senior members of the royal family. The monarchy depended on unity, and any internal dispute risked becoming a crisis far larger than the original incident. Others believed that ignoring the situation would be even more dangerous. If the privacy of the future queen could be challenged without consequence, what message would that send about the integrity of the institution itself? The palace now stood at a crossroads. Every conversation carried the weight of what might happen next. Every advisor understood that the next step could either calm the situation or fracture relationships that had taken decades to maintain. And for Prince William, the deeper he examined the situation, the harder it became to dismiss a troubling thought forming in the back of his mind. Because the more details he uncovered, the more the incident began to feel less like an isolated mistake and more like the first sign of something much larger. But the deeper William examined the situation, the more he began to question whether this incident was part of something larger. Behind palace gates, the royal family operates as both a family and an institution. When trust fractures in either role, the consequences can echo for years. The controversy surrounding Catherine's medical records was no longer just a technical issue. It had evolved into a question of boundaries, respect, and power within the monarchy itself. What had begun as a quiet internal alert was now slowly reshaping the atmosphere inside the royal household. The deeper the investigation unfolded, the clearer it became that this situation could not remain confined to a technical discussion about digital security. The issue had drifted into far more delicate territory where personal relationships, royal hierarchy, and long-standing tensions quietly intersected. And at the center of it all stood Prince William. Those close to him noticed a change almost immediately. He had always been protective of Catherine, but now that instinct sharpened into something far more determined. The possibility that someone within the palace had attempted to intrude into her private health records struck him as more than a breach of protocol. It felt like a betrayal of the unspoken boundaries that allowed the royal family to function, despite the intense pressures surrounding them. William had spent years preparing for the role that would one day place him on the throne. That preparation had taught him the delicate balance required to keep the monarchy stable. But it had also taught him that some lines could not be ignored. Catherine's privacy was one of them. As word of the investigation circulated quietly among senior advisors, a different concern began to surface, one rooted not in technology, but in relationships. Some palace officials warned that pushing the issue too aggressively could cause lasting damage within the royal family. The monarchy depended on unity, even when that unity required uncomfortable compromises. Raising questions about an access request connected to Camilla's office risked opening a conflict that could ripple through the entire institution. Others, however, argued the opposite. They believed that ignoring the incident would send a dangerous message that even the most private aspects of royal life could be quietly probed without consequence. If Catherine's confidential medical records were not protected with absolute seriousness, what protections truly remained? The debate quietly divided those closest to the palace leadership. Meanwhile, Catherine herself began hearing fragments of the situation. The details reaching her were incomplete, carefully filtered through advisors who wanted to avoid unnecessary alarm. Yet even those fragments were enough to create an uncomfortable realization. Something unusual had happened inside the palace, something involving her personal privacy. Those who spoke with her later described a calm response, but the underlying tension was impossible to miss. Catherine had spent more than a decade learning how to navigate royal life with composure, but even she understood that the issue now unfolding touched on deeply personal ground. Beyond the private conversations, another factor began influencing how the palace handled the matter: public image. The monarchy existed under constant scrutiny. Even the smallest internal conflict could become a media storm if the wrong detail leaked beyond palace walls. Advisors began quietly discussing how the situation might appear if it ever became public knowledge. Would it look like a misunderstanding? Or would it appear as a serious breach of trust inside the royal family? To prevent that question from ever reaching the outside world, senior aides began reviewing internal privacy procedures. Discussions emerged about tightening digital access protections and limiting administrative channels that could interact with medical records. Officially, these changes were framed as routine updates. Unofficially, they were a direct response to what had already happened. At the same time, several members of the extended royal family began attempting to ease the growing tension. Quiet conversations were held, words chosen carefully, each person hoping to prevent the situation from escalating further. Mediation, reassurance, and subtle diplomacy became the tools of choice. Yet despite those efforts, the atmosphere inside the palace remained uneasy. The investigation had not been fully resolved. Questions still lingered about who initiated the request and why it had been attempted in the first place. Every unanswered detail carried the potential to reopen the conflict. The situation even began affecting royal scheduling. Certain meetings were delayed. Events were quietly adjusted. Advisors became more cautious about who attended which discussions. It was subtle, almost invisible to the outside world. But those within the palace recognized the shift immediately. Something had changed. And perhaps most concerning of all was a growing fear shared by several insiders, the fear that the story might eventually leak. The palace had contained the issue so far, but secrets inside royal institutions had a way of surfacing when least expected. If that happened, the narrative would no longer belong to the palace. It would belong to the world. For a brief moment, however, it seemed possible that the situation might slowly settle into silence. Investigations were nearing completion. Tensions had begun to ease, and advisors hoped the incident could quietly fade into the long list of royal matters never discussed publicly. But just when it seemed the situation might quietly fade away, one final revelation forced the palace to confront the truth head-on. Royal institutions survive on discretion, but sometimes silence becomes impossible to maintain. After days of internal discussions and mounting tension, palace advisors realized a decision had to be made. The issue of Catherine's medical records could no longer remain buried inside confidential meetings. Prince William insisted that boundaries must be respected no matter who had crossed them. By this stage, the quiet investigation that had begun with a single digital alert had transformed into something much heavier. What started as a technical inquiry had forced the palace to confront uncomfortable questions about trust, authority, and the fragile boundaries that held the royal household together. Advisors now understood that ignoring the issue was no longer an option. If the monarchy hoped to maintain stability, the situation needed resolution careful, controlled, and decisive. Behind closed doors, palace leadership began reviewing the protocols surrounding royal medical privacy. These systems had long been considered among the most secure within the institution, designed specifically to prevent unauthorized access to deeply personal information. Yet the attempted breach had revealed something unsettling. Even the most carefully constructed safeguards could be tested from within. Security specialists, administrators, and legal advisors gathered to reassess every layer of protection surrounding the medical network. Access permissions were examined line by line. Administrative routes were analyzed. Digital authorization procedures were scrutinized with renewed urgency. The conclusion they reached was clear. The system had worked technically. The request had been blocked before any confidential information could be opened. But the fact that someone had attempted the access at all revealed a vulnerability that could no longer be ignored. New restrictions were introduced almost immediately. Administrative channels previously capable of submitting file requests were tightened or removed entirely. Only a smaller circle of verified medical personnel would now possess the authority to interact with the system at all. Even senior palace offices would face stricter limitations than before. Officially, these changes were described as routine improvements to internal privacy protections. Unofficially, they were a direct response to the incident. Prince William reportedly pushed strongly for those safeguards. For him, the matter was never simply about resolving a misunderstanding or calming internal tension. It was about making one principle unmistakably clear: Catherine's personal boundaries were not negotiable. Those close to the discussions later described William as calm but unwavering. He did not raise his voice. He did not escalate the conflict unnecessarily. Instead, he spoke with quiet certainty about the importance of protecting the dignity of the woman who would one day stand beside him as queen. Within the palace, advisors worked carefully to restore stability after the tense days of investigation. Conversations became less urgent. Meetings returned to their usual rhythm. Staff members who had sensed the unusual tension slowly resumed their routines. But beneath the surface, something had changed. Catherine's privacy now stood at the center of renewed institutional protection. Every administrative department understood that the line surrounding her personal health information had been reinforced with new seriousness. The message, though never spoken publicly, was understood clearly within the palace walls. Some insiders believed the swift response helped prevent a deeper fracture inside the royal household. Others quietly acknowledged that the incident had left lingering questions that might never fully disappear. Even as the palace moved forward, subtle signs of caution remained. Advisors became more careful when discussing private matters. Internal communications carried an extra layer of formality. The unspoken trust that once allowed certain information to move quietly between offices had been reshaped by the events of the past days. Beyond the palace gates, royal observers would later speculate about what had truly happened behind those closed doors. Some suspected a misunderstanding that spiraled into unnecessary tension. Others believed the incident revealed deeper rivalries and sensitivities within the royal structure. The truth, as always, remained protected by the palace's oldest tradition, silence. Publicly, nothing had happened. No statement was issued. No explanation offered. The royal family continued its duties as it always had, projecting unity and stability to the world beyond its walls. Official schedules continued. Public appearances proceeded without interruption. From the outside, the monarchy appeared unchanged. But inside Kensington Palace, those who had witnessed the investigation understood that the incident had quietly altered the balance of trust within the household. The systems had been strengthened. The privacy boundaries had been reinforced. The crisis had been contained. And so the monarchy moved forward, as it always did, calm on the surface, carefully guarding the complexities that lay beneath. Yet even after the immediate crisis passed, one question continued to linger in the corridors of the palace. The palace returned to its carefully managed routine, but the incident left an invisible fracture beneath the surface. Officially, the matter was resolved. Protocols were tightened. Conversations ended. Yet among those who knew the full story, one unsettling question refused to disappear. Was the attempt to access Catherine's medical records truly a misunderstanding, or something far more intentional? From the outside, life inside the royal household appeared unchanged. Engagements continued. Public appearances carried the same polished confidence the monarchy had mastered for generations. Speeches were delivered. Charities were visited. Cameras flashed as they always had. To the public eye, the palace projected calm, unity, and unwavering stability. But behind those carefully maintained walls, the memory of what had happened lingered quietly. The palace had chosen discretion over explanation. No official statement was ever released about the attempted access to Catherine's confidential medical records. There was no press briefing, no clarification, no public acknowledgement that the issue had even existed. Instead, the matter was folded back into the institution's most reliable strategy: silence. For centuries, the monarchy had survived not by explaining its internal conflicts, but by containing them. And so the story remained locked behind palace doors. Inside the administrative offices, however, the atmosphere had shifted. Staff who had once exchanged information freely now became noticeably more cautious. Emails were written more carefully. Conversations about sensitive matters were shortened or moved behind closed doors. Even routine discussions carried a subtle sense of awareness that had not been there before. The message was unspoken but unmistakable. Boundaries had been tested, and no one wanted to see them tested again. For Prince William, the experience left a lasting imprint. Those close to him noticed that his protective instincts around Catherine had grown even stronger. If anything, the incident had reinforced something he had believed for years: that the personal lives of his family must be defended with relentless vigilance. Catherine had already endured enormous pressure as the future queen. The glare of public attention followed her everywhere, dissecting every appearance, every decision, every moment of vulnerability. William had long accepted that public scrutiny came with royal duty, but the intrusion into her private medical information felt different. That line, he believed, should never have been approached. Among palace insiders, the debate about what truly happened never completely faded. Some remained convinced that the request had been nothing more than an unfortunate administrative mistake, a curious aide pressing the wrong command in a complex digital system. Others quietly questioned whether curiosity alone could explain such a precise attempt to bypass the system's confidentiality protections. Those conversations rarely lasted long. In the royal household, speculation had limits. Yet the uncertainty continued to linger in private discussions, resurfacing whenever the topic of palace security or internal trust arose. The digital logs had told part of the story, but they had never fully answered the question that mattered most. Who had truly intended to open those files? Outside the palace gates, royal observers sensed something subtle had shifted in the dynamics of the institution. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public disputes, no headlines exposing internal conflict. Yet those who studied the monarchy closely began noticing a faint change in tone, a quiet tightening of privacy, a more guarded approach to internal matters. It was the kind of shift that rarely produced immediate headlines, but over time it became part of the palace's internal history. Stories like this rarely entered the official record. They existed instead in whispered recollections among aides, in cautious conversations between advisors, in the quiet understanding shared by those who had witnessed the investigation unfold. Within royal circles, the incident slowly became something else entirely. One of the monarchy's untold tensions. A moment when the delicate balance of trust inside the palace had been tested by a single digital request that should never have existed. A moment that forced the institution to reinforce its boundaries while carefully protecting its image of unity. And perhaps most unsettling of all, the question that sparked the entire investigation was never fully resolved. Because long after the system alerts disappeared, and the protocols were strengthened. The deeper mystery remained untouched. Was the access request simply a misunderstanding buried inside palace bureaucracy? Or had someone, somewhere within the royal household, intentionally tried to reach information that was never meant to be seen? No public inquiry would ever answer that question. No official report would confirm it. The truth remained locked within private conversations, archived system logs, and the guarded memories of those who had witnessed the events unfold. And within the silent halls of the palace, the truth behind that single access request may remain one of the royal family's most closely guarded secrets.